Hi, so today's class we continue to talk about how to actually count music when we find it and how to figure that out from the beginning. And what came up today was a lot of terminology. So I wanted to identify and explain some of the basic terms that we use when we're actually practicing music and figuring it out. So what we started talking about was the idea of a big beat. So these terms I use are very universal, so you will hear this. For example, if you want to join one of the ensembles, you will hear me talk about these things. These words will come out of my mouth, and so this is what they mean. So again, if we're in 4/4, as this should make sense from our previous class, right? That means there are 4 quarter notes, right, in a measure. So just to keep it with quarter notes, this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you were to count this out loud, we identify them that way: 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? You could say these things. Now it can get a little bit more complicated, and you become more responsible for keeping track of things as you encounter more complicated rhythms. So for example, if we have quarter, quarter, half note, if you counted this out loud, you would count out loud 1, 2, 3, but then there would be no sound on beat 4 because that half note is sustained. So that would sound like 1, 2, 3, opposed to, just for a direct comparison, right? If this was a rest, it would be 1, 2, 3, right? And then this is silence. Okay? So that should make sense, right? And if you are in a different meter, say you're in 3/4, you'd only count up to 3. If you're in 2/4, you'd only count up to 2, and so forth. But identifying where these big beats are is very important, and it becomes important when you have things that subdivide. So this is another very common term, and you hear this all the time. And what a subdivision is any rhythmic value that breaks down into a smaller part than what is dictated in the time signature, in this case quarter notes. So if you're subdividing, if there are subdivisions rather, in something like 4/4, what you are likely to see are some eighth notes, right? These note values are smaller than, I'm going to run out of space here, are smaller than a quarter note, right? Oops. Always encountering fun things with technology here. Yes, right? So these are smaller than a quarter note. Now if you were to count this out loud, the important thing here is that our big beats, right, are identified at exactly the same time in the measure, regardless of these subdivisions. But the subdivisions, if we are in eighth notes, right, we will use and, right? And I use the shorthand of writing just like a little plus sign, and that's extremely common to see, but what you will be hearing is and, right? So this would sound like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay? And what's important is just like the big beats line up with the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 corresponding to the time signature, and the and of a beat is always an eighth note off, right? So it's always the eighth note that follows a big beat. So for example, if you had an eighth note rest, and now we are masters of rest notation, right? If we had an eighth note rest and then an eighth note followed by, let's say, a quarter note and then a half note, right? This still completes a measure. You would have silence on this big beat, right? You wouldn't say this out loud, but what you would say is and then 2, 3, and then 4 would be silent, right? But it's useful to count this way, one, because this is very universal. Everyone uses the same language when they're subdividing and counting out loud rhythm. But this is just very useful into kind of figuring something out on your own, right? So if I'm going to speak these two measures I just wrote out subsequently, okay? So it's going to sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2, 3. Okay? So this is hopefully making good sense here, but this is an important concept, and this language that is used here is so common, very universal. And these subdivisions are often on off beats, right? This is opposed to a big beat, right? An offbeat is something that will occur not on one of the big beats. So again, like this 8th note, right? Let's do another one. This 8th note rest. Right? Something like that, right? And this, of course, would be you wouldn't count this out loud, but this would get and 2. You wouldn't count this out loud, but this is where beat 3 is. You would say and then this, of course, you would also be silent, but this is beat 4. Okay? So now this measure, it will sound complicated. It is a little complicated, but this is what it looks like, okay? So if we are in 4, we'll count off 4 and then speak this measure I just wrote. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2, and. Right? These are offbeats. These are offbeats. And offbeats, every single time it does that, gosh. Offbeats occur when they are not on a big beat. So that is pretty straightforward, but that's what that language means. And you might have heard these things thrown around, and this is what all that adds up to. And then we spent a little bit of time, and perhaps this will be the last thing we talk about, understanding what the term pickup means. So we'll keep ourselves in 4/4 here. So a pickup generally is the beat that precedes the beginning of a measure. Or if you're familiar with music, it could also be a note that precedes the beginning of a measure in a phrase, or it could be a note that precedes a phrase itself. But in this instance, I'll show you what this might look like. Okay. So this is an example. Okay. Okay, so here are a few examples of pickups. So you can see that, and I've made these rests, I've put rests in to make this even clearer, but I'll show you some musical examples in a moment. But these pickups are just, I'll get a new color in here, it's always nice. So the pickups are specifically talking about the note that precedes and leads us into the beginning of the next measure, right? This note that leads us into the next measure, and so forth, okay? But this is what the pickup is, right? So I will count this line out loud, and you can hear how those pickups kind of are like a springboard into the next measure, okay? So I'm going to count off 4 beats, and then I'm going to read through this measure, counting out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. I'm so sorry, I messed up. Look at that. I got carried away. I'm going to do it one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 4. 1, and 1, 4, 1. Excuse my droning there, but right, that is what would be happening, right? I drone again, like carrying out that 1 in order to make it clear that there's sound happening still, right? So I'm just gonna write down here what I was speaking. Right? So I hope that that makes sense. And let's see. I did just show a couple examples of this occurring in music. Yeah. And this is, again, we're just talking about pickups. So you can see where I have there circled in blue. This is the note that's a pickup, right? It's leading into the next measure. This music is some music I've played before, right? So this is another pickup, right? It's preceded by a rest, so it's easy to identify. But here are just a couple examples for fun, more than anything, of pickups that do not follow a rest, but this note, right, is very long. It belongs to itself, kind of, and then these two eighth notes belong to this line, this chunk of music, right? Again, this is kind of beginning to identify phrases, but right here it happens again, right? These eighth notes are pickups, and they come and they're leading us into the next measure, right? Here's another pickup, and it's leading us here. So they happen in music so often, which is why I wanted to make sure that it's clear what that means and what it looks like. I was just trying to find a couple others, but that is what we discussed and how all of those things look, and I hope that makes sense. So I'll leave this up for a moment, and thank you for watching.